since I've started after much resistance to use TikTok in this Lord's year of 2025 with the intention of promoting my videos, I ended up noticing two things. First, the number of children and teenagers who use that platform is insane. And second, the number of children and teenagers with little flags and colorful emojis there is also insane. And I really mean children, because if you go to their profiles, you see that that's exactly what they are. And for example, here in Brazil, 41% of people who use TikTok tend to be between ages of 16 and 24 years old. And apparently this also happens in other countries as well. And this gave me a question. How many people from this TikToker generation, or even from my generation, the Generation Z, would be or at least identify as LGBTs? And initially, the data I found was specifically from the US, which immediately surprised me a lot, because apparently the number of people who identify as LGBT there in Generation Z alone is 28% of people, which would be practically a third of the people in this generation, which is really a very high number. And in the US, the big CEOs of companies and shareholders are fully aware of this, which is one of the reasons why today we have this quote-unquote cultural war, in which a large part of entertainment media, such as films and video games, which you normally consider that Generation Z or younger generations will preferentially consume, these media are also full of the so-called woke content. So when the film and game studios and companies are going to make things for these people, they actually take this in mind. And they always put forward the agendas for sexual inclusivity, for diverse characters, with this intention of trying to capture this audience, probably basing their decisions on these statistics. But that is a topic for another video. For now, and for me at least, it begs the question: why are younger people more likely to identify as LGBT and diverse groups? And one of the strongest arguments that exists for this type of argument, that I always see in any kind of argument or debate actually, is saying how people have always been like this, but before they were afraid to express themselves. So because of the way society is today, they ended up coming out of the closet more nowadays. But really, if you think about this argument for a while, you realize that it is an extremely weak argument, because when you took past generations in these same surveys, generations that are living today and were also questioned, you see that they had much lower numbers in comparison. This even applies for people from the Generation X and even millennials, who usually are the people who identify more as wokes, social activists, and SJWs, and so on. And if teenagers and young adults are the people who end up identifying themselves most like this, then we need to look at the subjectivities of these groups to find out why. And although we can only make hypotheses here, one of the main hypotheses that many people have is that of a possible psychological contagion, or even a social one. If you stop to think about it, for several generations of teenagers, there is always something that is in fashion. And in a similar way that apparently adults nowadays are infected to go to the gym and die of an overdose after stuffing their faces with electrolytes, anabolic steroids, juices, oils, pre-workouts, energy drinks, and caffeine mixes that not even the biggest crack addict in LA would dare to take. All of this shows that there is a human tendency to be contagious and to have certain behaviors that were completely unthinkable in other generations being replicated or at least propagated in the present. I remember 15 years ago, for example, when some gyms were started to become a little more trendy, let's say, and people's biggest problem was only paying for a gym membership for a month and then going just for 2 days of that payment. Nowadays, it is the opposite. Gyms are packed. You can see this on Instagram, for example. And this may have been a big factor in motivating all of this, actually. After all, if people start to participate more in a society that is electronic and virtual, appearances end up mattering contradictorily much more. If you look at surveys of people's attractiveness, when you look at the most important aspect for virtual relationships, for example, you'll find appearances in the first place for men and for women. Although everything here is just numbers, and a few years ago this might not even matter, society ends up changing, and with that people end up finding new strategies to gain relevance, status, and even attention from others. And if you want to know why gaining attention from other people is so important, you can go check out my video on why men shoot schools. But if you use Darwinian theories of evolution, it is even possible to infer about sexual selection as well, in which some behaviors end up being chosen by the group, usually females, to be then replicated. It is like the peacock's feathers that appear, and because of these peacocks are much more selected by the peahens. I don't know how it is pronounced. But of course, these feathers may have some advantages, like in keeping and scaring some predators away. But in general, there is also a tendency to make these peacocks slower and therefore an easier prey to be eaten as well. In other words, this characteristic, which is only focused on appearance, ends up having a detrimental factor for the peacock itself. But why? Why am I saying all of this? Well, because if you look over time, teenagers in particular have always had this issue of, let's say, sexual selection much more prominent than any other age group. In fact, one of the things that most predicts language change, that is, the tendency for a language to evolve or change drastically, involves not adults or academics who study languages, but rather the adolescent population, who by speaking in a new way, by creating new slangs, will change the language for future generations and for those who come after. How interesting, right? But back to the subject, some of the examples that can be cited of this social contagion, especially in teenagers, are, for example, of rockabillys of the 1950s in the US, who were there at the time of the beginning of the rock and roll with leather jackets, pompadours, jeans, and of course, Elvis Presley's hair. All because of this loud music they heard, the McDonald's they ate, or the Coca-Cola they drank. They wanted everyone to be this alternative culture due to the adults of the time who were much more rigid and focused on work and everything that you see in the best series of the world called Mad Men. My god, how good is that show, right? Then you go a decade later, in the 1960s, you have the hippies with slogans of peace and love, of being all against wars, of valuing nature, drugs, and alternative philosophies, and so on. In the 80s, we had the punks, the goths, who were atheists and wanted to go against the Christian idealism of adults and society. In the 90s, you had the grunges with Nirvana, who wanted to go against capitalism, which only wanted to make people another cog in the system or another brick on the wall. The emos in the 2000s and the e-girls and e-boys of today, and even the K-poppers who are probably 90% of teenagers as well. The fact here is that there is a general tendency for teenagers in particular to like groups, and that's normal. It is a phase where you're living the life in which you had to strictly follow every word of your parents to the ladder, to a phase where you can now just make your own decisions. Because we are social beings and grouping people together is always influential in itself, teenagers apparently are much more than anyone else. And also because they are in this linear space between childhood and adulthood, these are people who are discovering themselves. And if you look at the brains of teenagers, which are not yet fully developed yet, in areas of, for example, social inhibition, diligent behaviors, which make you think more about the future than the present, that is, the regions of prefrontal cortex that will only develop after this phase, according to the experience that a person has, you can imagine how much the teenager lacks this tendency to know how to say no to his group. Because if he no longer has the support of his parents, he will not want to be alone. And if he is a depressed and ugly guy who only lives in his parents' basement playing video games and wanting a gaming PC, this guy is also part of a social group. Even though this hypothetical person seems as social and isolated from everyone else, I'm pretty sure I just described at least 20 or even 30% of the people who are watching this video. I know that I was one of them. And in fact, I've made a video about this both on TikTok and YouTube, and also both in Portuguese and now in English, describing this exact type of person. And it was my most watched video in both of these languages, in all of these platforms as well. This is also insane. I described a person who didn't socialize, who only lived at home, who was lazy, who only wore black, and got a ton of comments of people saying how I was perfectly describing them. And why? Well, maybe it's the world we live in today. But maybe if so many people are like this, you can imagine how much social influence there is for these people to also have and maintain these behaviors. After all, let's go back to the beginning of the video where I say how almost half of the people who use TikTok are teenagers and young adults, not adults nor old people. No, I'm pretty sure old people are more on Facebook now. Poor people, old people. And this is the big question of this video. If so many young people end up identifying as LGBT and we don't see the same statistics for other generations, we need to ask ourselves how much of this ends up being driven by social influence. If you imagine how LGBT groups end up promoting exactly what teenagers want, which is social acceptance, for being one of us, for thinking like us, for identifying like us. And on top of that, you now have a purpose. Now you can go on the internet and attack everyone who's against these ideas that of this group you support. After all, one of the things that predicts socialization is a neurotransmitter called oxytocin, which is the social hormone. But it is not activated by any type of socialization. It is only activated when you are socializing with people you believe are the same as you or part of your group. It is one of the things that motivated Nazism, for example. We are all Aryans. Our people and our race are better than everyone else. And anyone who does not conform to us needs to be excluded from our group. And this is not only a characteristic unique to Nazism, but to any social group, especially when it is extreme. Football fan clubs, video game console wars, political parties, and so on. So if I am going to be excluded for not being part of this group, and if being part of a group gives me all of these things, all of these benefits that I might not get elsewhere, like acceptance, a purpose, and so on, then maybe it is much more worthwhile to be part of this group than to be outside of it, right? If you take into consideration how much girls are more likely to be social than boys, you can even argue for the rise of bisexual women as well. But mainly, there are many reasons for this to happen. There are advantages, and there are also social pressures within these groups, within these age ranges, to have and to be part of the masses, so to speak. If you are with me, you gain something. And if you are not, then it is your problem. Or even in worse of the cases, I am your enemy, or you become my enemy as well, and I will destroy you and put you to hell. And with these, social groups like the feminists and red pills began to rise, which I pretend to make videos about next. For now, this was the video. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, make a comment, share, and see you in the next time. Goodbye.